Before we begin, we want to say something clearly and directly. This is not entertainment. This is not a political opinion dressed up as research. What you are about to hear is a serious, evidence-based investigation of a possibility that very few people in mainstream media are willing to even ask out loud. We are going to present documented history, documented statements by real people who held real power, documented strategic doctrine, and documented patterns that, when placed next to one another, form a picture that should alarm every person on this planet regardless of their politics, their religion, or their nationality. We are not saying we know with certainty that this is what is happening. We are saying that the evidence is serious enough, and the stakes are enormous enough, that you deserve to hear it and decide for yourself. Because the question we are about to ask is this: is the Iran war the beginning of a deliberately engineered global catastrophe? And if so, who benefits? The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists maintains something called the Doomsday Clock. It is set by a panel of the world's leading scientists, physicists, and security experts, including 17 Nobel laureates. It represents their collective judgment of how close humanity is to existential catastrophe. As of the beginning of 2026, the Doomsday Clock sits at 89 seconds to midnight. That is the closest it has ever been to the end of everything in its entire history, which began in 1947. Over 40 armed conflicts are currently active across the globe. 3 separate nuclear escalation pathways have moved, in the judgment of security analysts, from theoretical to plausible within current geopolitical timelines. Those 3 pathways are Russia versus NATO over Ukraine, the United States and Israel versus Iran in the Middle East, and China versus Taiwan in the Pacific. The last remaining bilateral nuclear arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, known as New START, expired in February, with nothing negotiated to replace it. The United States, under President Trump, ordered the Pentagon to restart nuclear testing for the first time in 30 years. Russia and China have both been accused by American officials of conducting their own nuclear tests. China's nuclear arsenal is expanding on a trajectory that could see it reach rough parity with the United States and Russia within this decade. Meanwhile, the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran, which began on February 28, 2026, has already killed more than 1,400 Iranian civilians. It has killed Iranian scientists, military commanders, and the supreme leader himself. It has triggered Iranian missile strikes on American military bases across the entire Gulf region, on Arab partner states, on British facilities in Cyprus, Qatar, and Bahrain. It has driven oil prices to record highs. It has disrupted the Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves every single day. And it is actively expanding. This is the world we are living in. And we are going to ask the question that no major media outlet will ask. What if this is not a chain of accidents? What if there are people, real people with real names and real institutional power, who wanted exactly this? Who planned for it? Who needed it? To understand whether this is possible, we first have to understand that it has happened before, not as conspiracy theory, as documented, declassified official history. Let us begin with Operation Northwoods. In 1962, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff drafted and formally presented to the Secretary of Defense a proposal to conduct a series of false flag terrorist attacks on American citizens, on American military personnel, and on American infrastructure, and then blame those attacks on Cuba in order to justify a U.S. military invasion of Cuba. The plan included shooting down an American aircraft and blaming Cuba. It included sinking boats carrying Cuban refugees. It included staging attacks in American cities. The document was declassified in 1997. It is available to anyone. It was real. It was proposed by the highest levels of the American military to the civilian leadership of the United States government. It was rejected by President Kennedy, but it was proposed. The relevance of this is not that it succeeded. The relevance is that it reveals the willingness of powerful people within the American national security apparatus to manufacture a catastrophic event in order to justify a war they had already decided they wanted. Now let us move forward 38 years to the year 2000. A think tank called the Project for the New American Century, known by its initials PANAC, published a 76-page document titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategies, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. The document was a blueprint for total American military dominance of the planet. It called for massive increases in defense spending, the control of outer space, the ability to fight multiple major wars simultaneously, and the permanent maintenance of American military hegemony over every strategically important region on Earth. But there was a problem. The document acknowledged that this kind of transformation in American military posture would be politically and financially difficult to achieve, and that it would likely take a very long time to build the political will necessary to accomplish it, unless, the document stated, there was what it called some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. The signatories of that document included Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Scooter Libby, Elliott Abrams, Jeb Bush, and others who would go on to hold the most senior positions in the administration of George W. Bush. Less than 13 months after George W. Bush took office, September 11, 2001 occurred. In the judgment of critics, it was precisely the catastrophic and catalyzing event that the PNAC had publicly identified as the prerequisite for their program. Within 14 days of September 11th, PNAC members were publicly calling for war not only against Afghanistan, but against Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with the attacks. Within 18 months, the United States had invaded Iraq. The case for that invasion was built on intelligence that was known at the time by many senior officials to be false or deeply uncertain. And in the years that followed, under the banner of the global war on terrorism, the United States military budget grew from approximately $300 billion per year to over $700 billion per year. The defense industry, the surveillance industry, the private military contracting industry all grew enormously. The Patriot Act and a cascade of subsequent legislation permanently expanded the power of the American security state. Civil liberties were curtailed, international law was set aside, and a small number of very powerful people and institutions became extraordinarily wealthy. This is not theory, this is history. Now, let us talk about something that very few people outside of the national security world have ever heard of. It is called NUTS. The acronym stands for Nuclear Utilization Target Selection Theory. For most of the nuclear era, the dominant American strategic doctrine was called Mutually Assured Destruction, or MAD. It held, simply, that a full-scale nuclear war would result in the complete destruction of both sides, and therefore, neither side would ever start one. The threat of mutual annihilation was the guarantee of peace, but there has always been an alternative school of thought within American strategic planning. The NUTS theorists argue that nuclear war can, in fact, be limited and controlled, that it is possible to use nuclear weapons in a targeted, tactical way, specifically against an enemy's military infrastructure rather than its cities, while maintaining enough defensive capability to absorb any retaliation and prevent further escalation. Under this theory, nuclear war is not necessarily civilization ending. It is simply an extreme form of military conflict. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter signed Presidential Directive 59, which formally shifted American nuclear targeting strategy toward what was called the countervailing strategy. Its architect, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, stated that the new approach stressed killing the Soviet leadership first, then attacking military targets in the hope of Soviet surrender before total destruction of both sides. Defense analysts at the time described this modified approach as the doctrine of a winnable nuclear war. This idea did not die with the Cold War. The United States Air Force Global Strike Command, which controls America's land-based nuclear missiles and strategic bombers, and their approximately 30,000 personnel, has recently published an official 23-chapter training guide titled A Guide to Nuclear Deterrence in the Age of Great Power Competition. According to that guide, American strategic nuclear forces are expected to, and this is a direct quote from the document, perform functions including endurance throughout the various phases of a protracted and presumably limited nuclear war, and to establish escalation dominance and nuclear strategic superiority over any prospective opponent. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, reviewing this document, concluded that it dangerously promotes the idea that nuclear war is manageable and can be won, and does so to the 30,000 personnel whose hands are on those weapons. We are telling you this because before you can understand why someone within the power structure might believe that a major global war, even a nuclear one, could benefit them, you first have to understand that there are people in positions of real institutional power who genuinely believe that such a war is survivable and even winnable, provided it is managed properly from the beginning. provided they are the ones doing the managing, and provided they have spent years building the infrastructure to survive and dominate the aftermath. In 2007, investigative journalist and author Naomi Klein published a landmark book called The Shock Doctrine: The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Over 4 years and multiple continents of reporting, Klein documented what she argued was a consistent and deliberate pattern. Powerful political and economic actors systematically using the chaos of disasters, wars, and catastrophes to push through radical changes in the structure of political and economic power that would never be accepted under normal conditions. Her central argument was grounded in the work of the late Milton Friedman and the economists of the University of Chicago, who had developed what they called shock therapy, the idea that fundamental transformation of economic systems requires a moment of profound shock, a moment when the population is too disoriented, too frightened, and too overwhelmed to resist. In those moments, whatever can be implemented quickly becomes permanent. By the time people recover enough to resist, Klein traced this pattern through Pinochet's coup in Chile in 1973, through the economic restructuring of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, through the Asian financial crisis of 1997, through the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and through the reconstruction contracts that followed. In every case, the same pattern appeared: catastrophe, disorientation, rapid restructuring in the direction of increased privatization, increased power for financial and corporate interests, decreased democratic accountability, and increased surveillance and control of populations. The book was reviewed by Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, who wrote that while Klein's parallel between economic shock therapy and the CIA psychological experiments of the 1950s was overdramatic, she nonetheless provided a rich description of the political machinations required to force unsavory economic policies on resisting countries, and that the case against these policies is even stronger than the one Klein makes. Nobel Peace Prize winner Juan Manuel Santos called it as gripping as the best murder mystery, as well-researched as the best investigative journalism. The Nobel laureate and former chief economist of the World Bank validated the core analytical framework. Crisis is not just a byproduct of power struggles. It is, in documented and repeated historical cases, a tool of power struggles. It is manufactured, or at minimum exploited to a degree that suggests advanced planning, by those who have the most to gain from the changes that crisis makes possible. Now ask this question: if a global catastrophe of sufficient scale were to occur, what changes would become possible in its aftermath that are currently politically impossible? The answer is almost any change at all. The post-World War II international order was built in the immediate aftermath of the most catastrophic war in human history. The United Nations was created. The Bretton Woods financial system was created, establishing the dollar as the world's reserve currency. NATO was created. The International Monetary Fund was created. The World Bank was created. The entire architecture of international institutions and rules that has governed the world for 80 years was built in the window of maximum shock that followed the devastation of 1939 to 1945. The people who designed that order were not saints. They were strategists. They understood that a catastrophe of sufficient scale creates a window in which the foundations of human organization can be rebuilt from scratch, and that whoever controls the process of rebuilding controls the future. That order is now under unprecedented stress. China's economy has surpassed the United States by purchasing power parity. The BRICS coalition has expanded and is explicitly building alternative financial institutions, alternative payment systems, and alternative diplomatic frameworks that operate outside of American and Western institutional control. The Global South, comprising the majority of the world's population, has been increasingly unwilling to accept the existing rules-based international order that was built by Western powers to serve Western interests. From the perspective of a certain kind of strategic thinker, someone who holds great power within the existing order, and who sees that order being dismantled through peaceful economic and diplomatic competition with China and Russia. The rational response might be to consider whether a controlled global catastrophe, one that sufficiently disrupts the rising challengers while preserving the core capabilities of the existing power structure, might reset the board in a way that decades of conventional diplomacy and economic competition cannot. This is not something we are inventing. This logic has been explicitly articulated by people within mainstream strategic circles. One peer-reviewed strategic analysis of the current Iran war stated that by demonstrating overwhelming high-technology military force and conducting precision strikes against the Iranian leadership, the United States is delivering, and this is a quotation, a clear and conclusive unsubtle warning to potential near-peer global competitors such as Russia and China. The elimination of the Iranian threat is described as a mechanism to maximize American hegemony and demonstrate that the U.S. still has the ability and the will to forcibly reshape the world's geopolitics. But notice, the logic of that statement extends beyond Iran. If the goal is to demonstrate the ability and will to forcibly reshape the world's geopolitics, then the Iran war is not the objective. It is the demonstration. And Russia. And the real message is not about nuclear non-proliferation. It is about who makes the rules and what happens to those who try to change them. Let us now become very specific about the people and networks involved. A think tank called the Vandenberg Coalition was founded in 2021. Its chair is Elliott Abrams, a longtime neoconservative who has served in multiple American administrations and who was one of the original signatories of the PNAC founding documents. In January 2025, the first weeks of Trump's second term, the Vandenberg Coalition published a document explicitly calling for military action against Iran. Several members of the Vandenberg Coalition's advisory board subsequently took positions inside the Trump administration, including in the Pentagon, the Office of the Trade Representative, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Office of the Deputy Special Presidential Envoy for Middle East Peace. Investigative reporting by Jacobin magazine documented what it called a dark money-backed network of neoconservatives and Israel lobbyists that has been working quietly over the past year to push the Trump administration to launch a military intervention in Iran. The network includes the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the American Enterprise Institute, and multiple Israel lobby organizations, all of which have deep and documented ties to the defense industry through their donors and board members. The degree of overlap between this network and the people who built the justification for the 2003 Iraq War is striking. The same think tanks, the same individuals, the same pattern of producing white papers, opinion pieces, congressional testimony, and private briefings that create the intellectual and political infrastructure for a war that has already been decided upon by a much smaller group. Al Jazeera's investigation into the current Iran war concluded that the Trump administration was recycling the rhetoric of 2003 to justify a new escalation against Iran, but with a fractured team, isolated diplomacy, and a dangerous information chaos. And just as in 2003, the intelligence was shaped to support the predetermined conclusion. Trump told the American people at his State of the Union address in February 2026 that Iran had restarted its nuclear program and was developing missiles capable of striking the United States. Days later, the IAEA reported that it had no evidence of an organized nuclear weapons program. One American intelligence official's preliminary assessment, which the Trump administration called a political leak, found that Iran had moved much of its enriched uranium before the strikes and that the underground facilities had not actually been destroyed. Within 24 hours, the CIA director contradicted that assessment and declared the damage severe. We have seen this before. The mechanism is identical. Now let us be clear about the specific pathways through which the Iran war could escalate into something far larger, and why some strategic thinkers might actually want those pathways to activate. The first pathway runs through Russia. Russia has signed a bilateral strategic partnership with Iran without a mutual defense clause. Russia condemned the strikes but has taken no direct action. However, Russia has been providing Iran with intelligence about American military targets. Russia's military is fully engaged in Ukraine, and Russia has watched the United States demonstrate precision decapitation strike capability against a peer-level regional power. Every senior Russian military planner knows that this is a demonstration with Russia as the intended audience. Russia's nuclear doctrine has explicitly lowered its threshold for nuclear use in response to conventional attacks on Russian territory, or what it perceives as existential threats. The question is not whether this affects Russian strategic calculations. It does. The question is how. It is a fundamental question that shapes the future. The second pathway runs through China. China imports 30% of the world's seaborne oil through the Strait of Hormuz. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has achieved in the current conflict, directly threatens the Chinese economy and Chinese energy security. China has been expanding its nuclear arsenal rapidly. China has been watching the United States demonstrate its willingness to launch preemptive attacks during diplomatic negotiations, without congressional authorization, without UN Security Council approval, and in the face of almost universal international condemnation. China controls the production of rare earth minerals that are essential to American weapons systems, microelectronics, and military manufacturing. The question is not whether this affects Chinese strategic calculations. It does. The third pathway runs through nuclear proliferation. Chatham House, one of Britain's most respected foreign policy institutions, issued a stark warning in March 2026. The Iran war is triggering a new wave of nuclear proliferation that will make the world permanently less safe. The logic is simple. Iraq gave up its weapons program. It was invaded, and its leader was killed. Libya gave up its weapons program. Its leader was captured and killed. Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons it inherited from the Soviet Union. It was invaded. Iran has been negotiating about its nuclear program for decades. It was attacked during active negotiations. The lesson that every government without nuclear weapons is now drawing is obvious. Nuclear weapons are the only reliable protection against American military action. Saudi Arabia has already signed a mutual defense agreement with nuclear-armed Pakistan. South Korea is reconsidering its non-nuclear posture. Turkey and Poland are having public discussions about domestic nuclear capability. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has warned that the Iran war and the collapse of New START, combined with the absence of any active arms control negotiations between the major powers, has created a situation in which the risk of nuclear use is higher than at any point since the 1980s. Not because anyone has decided to use nuclear weapons, but because the number of actors, the number of weapons, the number of doctrines, and the number of potential escalation pathways have all grown simultaneously, while the institutional mechanisms for managing them have collapsed. And here is the strategic question that haunts this entire situation. If you are a faction within the American or British power structure that has concluded that the current international order cannot survive the rise of China, that peaceful economic competition will result in American decline and the loss of Western financial and military dominance, and that some kind of reset of the global power structure is therefore inevitable. Would you rather that reset happen through a managed confrontation that you initiate on a timeline you choose, using military technology that you have developed and that your adversaries have not fully matched, while you still hold the advantages of the existing financial architecture? Or would you rather let it happen on China's timeline in 20 or 30 years, when China has fully deployed its military modernization program, when the petrodollar system has been eroded by decades of BRICS alternative infrastructure, and when the window for Western favorable reset has permanently closed? This is the darkest and most important question in geopolitics today. And it is the question that the evidence suggests some people in positions of real power have already answered. Let us now do what serious analysis requires. Let us examine the evidence for this possibility and the evidence against it. The evidence that supports the possibility is substantial. The PNAC document explicitly stated the need for a catastrophic and catalyzing event to accelerate the program of American military transformation. That was a public, documented, signed statement by people who went on to hold the most senior positions in the U.S. government and who prosecuted a war based on false intelligence. The Vandenberg Coalition and its affiliated network have produced a documented, traceable lobbying effort to produce exactly the war against Iran that began in February 2026. The overlap between that network and the defense industry is documented through donor records and board memberships. The decision to launch the strikes during active negotiations, in which progress had been acknowledged by all parties, is inconsistent with a government that actually preferred a diplomatic resolution. Governments that prefer diplomacy do not bomb their counterparts while diplomats are still in the room. The Trump administration provided inconsistent and shifting justifications for the war, moving between nuclear threats, missile threats, regime change, protection of American citizens, and oil security. Inconsistency of justification is a consistent feature of manufactured pretexts. The collapse of all nuclear arms control institutions, including New START, combined with the restart of American nuclear testing, is creating precisely the kind of dangerous strategic environment in which limited nuclear use becomes more conceivable. This does not happen by accident. The absence of any credible post-conflict plan is telling. Multiple analysts, from the Atlantic Council to the European Council on Foreign Relations to the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, have noted that the administration has no coherent endgame. If the goal is simply to manage a regional war to a defined conclusion, the absence of an endgame is a strategic failure. But if the goal is escalation rather than resolution, the absence of an endgame is exactly what you would expect. And perhaps most significantly, every single institutional beneficiary of this conflict, the defense industry, the intelligence apparatus, the financial interests tied to dollar hegemony, the political networks that have wanted this war for 30 years, is benefiting right now. That is a fact. Now let us be equally honest about the evidence against. Full-scale world war, including nuclear exchange, would be catastrophic for everyone, including the elites who might theoretically want to exploit the chaos. History shows that the people who start great wars rarely control their outcomes. Napoleon wanted European dominance. He got Waterloo. The Kaiser wanted German hegemony. He got the armistice. Hitler wanted a 1,000-year Reich. He got the bunker. The idea that any faction of the existing power structure could start a world war, possibly a nuclear one, and survive it with enhanced power intact requires an extraordinary level of either confidence or delusion. The genuine complexity of military and political systems means that escalation is extremely difficult to control once it begins. Clausewitz called it the fog of war. Modern complexity theorists call it nonlinear dynamics. The Iran war is already producing consequences that neither the United States nor Israel fully predicted or intended, including the degree of damage to Gulf state infrastructure, the solidarity of European condemnation, and the speed with which Iran moved to close the Strait of Hormuz. The factions we are describing are not monolithic. They have different interests, different timelines, and different risk tolerances. The idea of a fully coordinated elite plan requires a degree of organizational coherence that historically powerful elites do not achieve. What they do achieve is alignment of incentives, which produces similar behaviors without requiring explicit coordination. And the most important counterargument is this: catastrophic escalation kills elites too. Nuclear war does not respect bunkers. The people most likely to survive a nuclear exchange are the people who are least connected to the existing power structure, people who live in remote rural areas, people who have developed self-sufficient communities, people who are not concentrated in the financial, political, and military centers that would be primary targets. The people who benefit most from the current order are also the people most concentrated in the cities and institutions that would be destroyed first. Here is our assessment, having investigated this as thoroughly as we are able. We do not believe there is a unified, centrally coordinated group of people who have sat in a room together and decided to trigger a world war. That is too simple, too conspiratorial, and inconsistent with how power actually operates. What we do believe, and what the evidence strongly supports, is this: there is a network of interconnected financial, military, industrial, and political interests in the United States and United Kingdom, whose power depends on the continuation of the existing global order, specifically the petrodollar system, American military supremacy, and the network of institutions built after World War II. That network has concluded, or is in the process of concluding, that the peaceful rise of China and the BRICS alternative represents an existential challenge to their power that cannot be managed through normal diplomatic and economic competition. Within that network, there are factions who believe that a controlled, decisive military confrontation with the axis of states that most directly challenges the existing order, an axis that includes Iran, Russia, and ultimately China, is preferable to the slow erosion of Western power that is already underway. The Iran war is the opening of that confrontation. Whether it was deliberately designed to escalate, or whether the people who started it genuinely believe they can contain it, the structural logic of the situation produces escalation pressure regardless of anyone's intentions. And critically, within the network that has prosecuted this war, there are specific individuals and institutions who have privately gamed scenarios in which a level of global conflict and destruction, well below full nuclear exchange, could produce a new international order more favorable to continued Western financial and military dominance. People who believe, drawing on doctrines like nuts and countervailing strategy, that limited nuclear use is survivable. People who believe, drawing on the history of the shock doctrine, that catastrophe creates opportunities for restructuring. People who have spent careers in institutions that profit from conflict and that grow more powerful as civilian institutions are weakened. These people are not supervillains. They are human beings operating within institutional incentive structures that reward aggressive risk-taking, that valorize military strength, that see the decline of American power as the worst possible outcome, and that have the historical examples of previous generations of elites who used catastrophic events to restructure the world in their favor. The danger is not that they have planned a world war. The danger is that they have created conditions under which a world war becomes increasingly probable, while simultaneously being the people in the best position to exploit its aftermath. Let us be very concrete about where we are right now. Iran has watched 3 countries, Iraq, Libya, and Ukraine, abandon their weapons programs or their nuclear arsenals, and subsequently be destroyed or invaded. Iran will not forget this lesson. Whatever government eventually emerges in Tehran, whether it is a replacement Islamic Republic, an opposition government backed by the West, or something else entirely, the lesson of 2026 will be burned into its strategic calculations. The only reliable protection against American military action is a nuclear deterrent. Iran will pursue nuclear weapons with greater urgency after this war than it did before it. A preventive war has produced the very outcome it claimed to prevent. Meanwhile, the war has produced exactly the kind of multipolar nuclear proliferation environment that experts have long warned is the most dangerous possible configuration of nuclear risk. Saudi Arabia is acquiring nuclear partnership with Pakistan. South Korea is reconsidering its posture. Turkey is having a public debate. Japan is watching. Israel has between 90 and 400 nuclear warheads and no declared doctrine and no international oversight. And the United States is restarting nuclear testing while no arms control framework exists. The Chatham House analysis concludes that the Iran war risks triggering the most significant wave of nuclear proliferation since the NPT was signed. It specifically notes that the lesson being drawn by every non-nuclear state is that nuclear weapons are the only reliable protection against American military action. This is a correct lesson, and acting on it will make the world vastly more dangerous for everyone. The risk of a world war beginning is not primarily the risk that someone decides to start one. It is the risk that a system with more actors, more weapons, more doctrines, fewer institutional constraints, and more overlapping escalation dynamics produces a nuclear exchange through accident, miscalculation, or the kind of cascading crisis that no one fully controls once it begins. That risk is not theoretical. It is the highest it has been since the early 1980s, according to every major institution that tracks it. We are going to end this documentary the way every serious investigation of dangerous power should end. Not with despair, with instruction. The first thing you should do is refuse to be manipulated by the framing of the conflict you are being offered. The conversation you are being invited to participate in is either support the war against Iran or Israel has too much influence over America. Neither of those conversations leads you to the structural questions. The structural questions are: who benefits, who decided, what is the actual endgame, and what are they not telling you? The second thing you should do is understand that the most dangerous moments in history have not been the moments when bad actors did bad things openly. They have been the moments when good people accepted a framing that had been designed to prevent them from seeing what was actually happening. The third thing you should do is support every institutional mechanism for accountability and transparency that still exists. Congressional oversight of war powers, investigative journalism, international law, arms control advocacy, civil society organizations that track the defense industry, the lobbying networks, and the revolving door between government and the industries that profit from conflict. These institutions are imperfect and corrupted. They are also the only tools that exist for preventing the people who benefit from catastrophe from engineering one. The fourth thing you should do is talk about this. Not in the language of conspiracy, which is designed to make serious questions seem ridiculous. In the language of evidence, of documented history, of institutional incentive analysis, of structural geopolitical logic. The PNAC document is real. Operation Northwoods is real. The shock doctrine is real. The Vandenberg Coalition is real. The collapse of nuclear arms control is real. The Doomsday Clock at 89 seconds to midnight is real. These are not theories. They are facts, and they belong in the public conversation. And the fifth thing you should do is understand the stakes with absolute clarity. A full-scale nuclear exchange between major powers would kill hundreds of millions of people in the initial strikes. It would produce a nuclear winter that scientific modeling suggests would reduce global temperatures by 15 to 25 degrees Celsius. Agricultural systems globally would collapse within 2 to 3 years. Food production would fall by an estimated 50 to 70% within a decade. Billions of people who survived the initial exchange would face starvation. Human civilization as we know it would not survive. This is not a policy debate. This is not a geopolitical competition. This is the question of whether the human species continues. And the people who are making decisions right now, in Washington and Tel Aviv and Moscow and Beijing, are making them inside institutional frameworks that were built for a world that no longer exists, with weapons that no human psychology was designed to fully comprehend, guided by doctrines that some of the most powerful of them genuinely believe make nuclear war manageable and winnable. That belief is wrong. We know it is wrong because no one has ever survived one. We began this documentary by saying that we were going to ask the question that no major media outlet will ask. Here it is, stated as simply as possible. Is there a faction within the power structures of the United States and United Kingdom that believes a major global war, triggered by the Iran conflict, would benefit them? By resetting the international order on terms more favorable to continued Western financial and military dominance? The answer is yes. There is evidence that such a faction exists, that it has thought through this scenario, that it has the institutional positions and the doctrinal framework to act on it, and that the current Iran war is at minimum consistent with the early stages of the strategy it would require. Is this faction deliberately engineering a world war? The answer is, we do not know. What we do know is that the distinction between deliberately engineering a catastrophe and creating conditions under which catastrophe becomes increasingly inevitable may be smaller than most people believe. And we know that the people who have the most to gain from the chaos and the most resources to survive it and exploit it are the same people who are making the decisions that are bringing it closer every day. What are you going to do with that information? That is the question that matters.